I would like to introduce Gil, who is our speaker today. And Gil is a colleague of mine. He is a tour guide. But on top of that, he is a lawyer. And on top of that, he studied international relationship. And on top of that, he actually studied just for himself so much about the Mediterranean history and the history of the development of the relationship between the different countries around the Mediterranean, well, in our region. And he's focused on quite a few topics, and one of them is the water subject, which is crucial for us and crucial for Jordan, because we both don't have enough of it. And as it turns out, the lack of water and the part of the peace accord which has to do with water are one of the obstacles, or maybe the obstacle, for a warmer peace between Israel and Jordan. So I've heard his presentation. He made a special presentation for tour guides. So I found it fascinating and eyes-opening, and so I invited him to our project. So that's all I had to say. And Gil, we are looking forward to listening to you.
Thank you very much, Julia. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to be hosted by you. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Yes? Okay.
Yeah, I can hear you well.
Great. Thank you. It's a pleasure being hosted by you and Steve, and to meet everybody. And it's my first time. So thank you very much for the opportunity. As for myself, I live on a moshav outside Jerusalem. The name of the moshav is Nes Harim, with my wife and 4 daughters. And I've been guiding for 15 consecutive years until last March, when all hell, you know what. So we are now, fixing the house and stuff like that, and trying to do our best under these unique and strange circumstances. Back in April, some people have contacted me and asked me to give all sorts of lectures. I gave a few. This is one of them. And this one specifically focuses on water issues in the entire Middle East, which is a lecture in its own right. Later on, we took 42 guides, when that was still doable, on a 2-day trip in northern Israel to go through all of the places that I'm going to mention, at least some of the places I'm going to mention, places that are typically off the beaten path for the ordinary tourist who come to Israel, but are a bit more known for the ordinary Israeli who's traveling through Israel. So I've presented to them what I'm going to present to you guys right now. And this is water and geopolitics. Can I share, Julia? Okay. Let me just share the screen.
Okay, בוודאי, share screen.
Okay, here we go.
So as you're getting ready to share your screen, I would like to remind you that you have the PayPal account, and donations are highly appreciated, and they all will be directed to Gil. So just a little reminder. That's it. I'm quiet.
Thank you very much, Julia. So the title is Water and Geopolitics in the Middle East, and that's not only in the modern Middle East. Water has been the main issue in the entire Middle East for over 4,000 years. We hear back in Genesis 22, 21 about the fight between Abraham and Abimelech, king of Gerar, over the well, and how they will divide it between them and plant a tree to basically solidify the peace treaty between them. So water has always been the #1 key factor in the entire Middle East. And that's obvious because the water sources in the Middle East are scarce, and therefore people who are fighting over them for millenniums. Specifically in modern times, water has played and still plays to a certain extent a very important role in Israel's foreign policy, as well as its internal policy. And we cannot survive here with the amount of water that naturally we had here. So today we have desalination, we have water treatment, we have all sorts of modern inventions, but that was not the case back 100 years ago, when the modern Zionist movement, modern at the time, was trying to revive Jewish nationalistic hopes and bring back millions of Jews to live back in Israel, which back then was still called Ottoman Palestine. And so that's the time to highlight that until World War I, the Middle East has never, ever looked on the map the way it does today. we need to remember that all of what you see today on the map is just one big Anglo-French invention made at the aftermath of World War I due to Anglo-French interest that had nothing to do with the local aspirations of Jews or Arabs. In fact, the British were supporting the Jews in a certain way called the Balfour Declaration, not so much because they liked the Jews that much, but more because it played into their interest as the British Empire more than it did anywhere else. And so if we go to the first slide, we see how in 1916, just a bit before that, by the way, before World War I, Britain and Germany were fighting over the dying man on the Bosphorus Straits. That's the nickname of the Ottoman Empire. And that dying man had the loot of the oil fields in Kirkuk, and I'm using the pointer here to point out to you guys the oil fields in Kirkuk. No wonder that Aramco, the biggest oil consortium in the world, okay, was based out of Kirkuk until 1988, I think, until it became Saudi Aramco and then moved to Saudi. But in 1871, this was the first place on planet Earth where oil was found outside the United States. This is also a land bridge between Turkish, German, Austrian empires and the jewel of the crown of the British Empire further east in India. And so this was a key strategic area, still is to this day, in the geopolitics of pre-World War I between British and German interests. Basically, the British were number one worldwide, and they wanted to preserve their position and strengthen their hegemony. However, the Germans wanted to dispossess the Brits from their role as the world number one superpower and take over as number one based out of Berlin. This is why the Germans were allying themselves with the Ottoman Empire before World War I and during World War I. That's why they were allies. So they could together, so they hoped to defeat the British and kick them out from the Suez Canal, kick them out from India, from Persia, and from other interests in the region.
That was the end of the 2 o'clock ring.
Including the Red Sea. And I can hear some people talking in the background. In any case, that's what happened before World War I, and the Germans were building a huge railroad, some of which can still be visible to this day, that was cutting across the entire Ottoman Empire, hoping to connect the Baltic Sea from Hamburg all the way to the Persian Gulf head, down here in what is today's Kuwait. This was a megalomaniac project held by Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, who was trying to basically create a land alternative to the British control worldwide by sea. And so whatever the British were gaining by sea, Wilhelm was trying to dispossess from them by land using this railroad. And the construction of this railroad, which, by the way, was completed only in 1940, was putting so much tension and gunpowder between the Germans and the Brits to the extent that all you needed is a spark. And the spark happened in June of 1914 and started World War I with all the allies between all the European superpowers and eventually an avalanche that would result with a war called the Great War, because nobody knew there would be another World War, and hence it was not called the First World War, but the Great War. During the Great War, basically Britain wanted everybody to fight in Europe, so Britain could come in the back door from Egypt and take the Middle East and dissolve the Ottoman Empire with all of its resources, so the British Empire could have all of that oil harnessed to British interests, so they could later on send that oil to the western side of the British Empire as well as the eastern side of the British Empire. And that's why the first move ever made by the British in World War I was to send a whole division from India to Kuwait, and from here trying to go all the way to Baghdad, trying to dismantle this section of the German railroad, hoping to disconnect the Germans from their grip over the Persian Gulf. The whole division was caught from the general down to the last shoe polisher, but just the fact that this is the first thing the British ever did in World War I, far, far away from London, proves how important this railroad has been to the Germans and how threatening it was feeling to the British. Now, in World War I, the British were making all sorts of promises. They first promised to the Arabs, a big Arab state, Later on, they offered the French that when the war will be over and the Middle East will be Anglo-French. And all of this, guys, that I'm pointing now in 1916 is well before the British and the French even took the Middle East. This is still Ottoman Empire in reality when the British and the French are drawing it on paper, divided between them. And so what happens is that in 1916, the British and the French have signed, never mind why now, an agreement called the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Sykes was the British foreign minister and Picot was his French parallel, according to which the whole of the Middle East was going to be divided between two different French zones of influence and two different British zones of influence. The British cared about the oil and their interest in the southern part of the Middle East, and the French cared about their interest in the northern part of the Middle East. Please note that what's marked here in yellow was going to be neither French nor British, and this is most of the state of Israel of today if you include the West Bank into it, according to your political opinion. Never mind that for now. And what we see here is that this was going to be kept as an international regime, protected under the four superpowers that were allies at the time: Britain, France, Italy, and Russia. These are Christian countries, and they all still have interest in what was going on here, and therefore it made sense to keep all of this internationalized. If we zoom in on this section, we see that this is what you see. What you see here in yellow is what you see here in purple. And what you see here in purple is an area with strange lines that are drawn like on the map with a ruler. Please note that only in the English language the word ruler has a double meaning. Okay? It's not only the one who rules, but which tool he uses to demarcate the line. So every time the British were involved anywhere, even in your own United States political map, every time you see a nice line on the map that is completely straight, you know it was drawn by someone with a British mindset. In any case, what you see here in purple was allocated to be that international area that was going to be shared between Great Britain, France, Italy, and Russia. But even when the British were willing to offer the French whatever, to keep them at war with the Germans, so they could occupy as many German forces on the Western Front in Europe as possible, and prevent the Germans from coming all the way to the Middle East and kick the British out of here. So the British at that time, 1916, were willing to offer the French whatever it took to keep the French in the war against the Germans. But even then, when they gave the French all of this, and when they made this Holy Land international, they still kept their grip over this small greater Haifa Bay area. My assumption, guys, is that most of you have been to Israel and that most of you have certain familiarity with the country. Okay, so I'm starting from a higher level than what I would do with ordinary tourists. Thank you. And so the British, even at the time they're willing to offer whatever to the French, were still keeping that greater Haifa Bay area under direct British rule, though the closest British rule was a few hundred kilometers away from it. Why would the British care so much about Haifa and Akko? I can't remember that there are Christian holy sites over there. There are Baha'i holy sites, but that was not a British interest at the time. And the main reason is that the British already knew that Kaiser Wilhelm's railroad was connected with Haifa. What the Germans have left behind was connected to the Mediterranean in only one place, and that's Haifa. The British knew that Haifa had a deep water port, that the Germans were already building, and the British were planning on turning Haifa into one of the 10 biggest military installations in the entire British Empire. What the British wanted to do, and I'm going back to the first map, is to take the oil from Kirkuk, that I'm now pointing out with the pointer, sending it through this area, through this barren desert, all the way to this crossroads, and from here, send it all the way to Haifa, that was going to be under British rule, refine it and send it to the western part of the British Empire, whereas the oil was going to be divided here, so a substantial portion of it will go through another British-controlled area all the way down, not to Kuwait or to Iran, but right down in the middle. And that's why Iraq has its only port out to the sea. And from here, it was going to be refined and be shipped to the eastern portion of the British Empire. Therefore, the British wanted to have the French dealing with whatever ethnical variety the one has to deal in the northern part of the Middle East. And the British wanted to be utilitarian and deal with all the oil coming from the southern part of the Middle East. And with this in mind, the British have created an axis. The British have created a very important area in world geopolitics from which oil was shipped to both ends of the British Empire, the empire where the sun was never setting. And so back in 1916, the British didn't give any Balfour Declaration. The British have divided the Middle East between themselves and the French and a few others and have kept all the goodies to themselves. There's no Balfour Declaration in 1916. So the excuse that the Balfour Declaration was given in 1917 due to some sort of, I would say, ideological reasons, I don't buy that, because I don't see a difference in British ideology between 1916 and 1917. And in any case, the reason why the Balfour Declaration was given is a topic for a whole different lecture, okay? That is another hour, so not tonight, with your permission. And so what I'm doing now is to point out, first and foremost, the connection that the British wanted to make between Kirkuk and Haifa. And that connection is why the Middle East was eventually carved between these three British-controlled areas: Iraq, Jordan, and eventually Israel. And now moving over to this next slide, and the next slide shows you the difference between 1916, no British commitment to the Zionist movement, no Balfour Declaration, no promise to allow Jews to come and settle in this country, no promise for Jewish homeland whatsoever, because this was going to be all international. This was not going to be Jewish or not even partly Jewish. Whereas a year later, Mr. Balfour, who eventually will inaugurate the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, was the one who gave Mr. Rothschild his famous Balfour Declaration, whose content I'm sure you all know. And so now we step forward from this point on with a British commitment that was put into practice, unlike their promises elsewhere that typically were violated. And the British promise to the Zionist movement was put into practice because it was a British interest. And Winston Churchill actually wrote an article back in 1920 that I invite you guys to look for online, in which he's stating openly why the British Empire supported the Zionist movement and not supported other segments of Judaism that were bigger at that time. In any case, after World War I, the Arabs and the Jews, both equipped with a different British promise. The Arabs were hoping to get a big Arab state, and the Jews were hoping to get a national home, whatever that meant. So their respective leaders, Weizmann, the head of the World Zionist Organization, and Faisal, the elder son of the Sharif Hussein of Mecca, who allied himself with the British and eventually was becoming famous in the movie Lawrence of Arabia. So Weizmann and Faisal, each equipped with a different British promise, actually sat down and got to an agreement that is partially shown on this map here, according to which the whole of the Middle East was going to be one big Arab state. That's the British promise to the Arabs. Whereas inside that big Arab state, there was going to be a Jewish autonomy whose borders were going to follow these purple lines. You clearly see how this is bigger than the modern state of Israel. By far bigger than the modern state of Israel, even if you include the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and the Golan Heights into it. Now, the people who sat down and came with these lines were all Jews from the academia. These were professors and doctors. These were people who knew what they were talking about. These were agronomists. These were people, hydrologists. These were people who knew how important water had been. They did not agree. They refused to accept the line that you see here on the map from 1916, made by the British and their allies, according to which the Jordan River, south of the Sea of Galilee, was going to become a border between British Empire and an international area. Okay, this is the first time in history that anyone in all of the land of Israel history has ever called the Jordan River a border. Guys, the Jordan River has never been a border until the British made it such. This happened in 1916. Before that, whomever ruled one side of the Jordan has always ruled the other side of the Jordan. Even 12 tribes, you know, back in biblical times, 9.5 tribes were west of the Jordan River, 2.5 tribes were east of the Jordan River. Every empire that had its grip over this area always controlled both sides of the Jordan River. And even the British Empire, when the war was over, controlled both sides of the Jordan River. But they chose to divide, okay, the two sides between two different entities. So the Jordan River became a border, guys, only 100 years ago. That's the first time in history that anyone has ever called the Jordan River a border. Before that, it has never been a border in any history of any nation, of any era. In any case, Weizmann and Faisal agreed not to accept the Jordan River as a border, because if you follow this map, you see the Jordan River, okay, deep inside both sides of the land of Israel. And the people who actually put that line on the map are people who knew how important water had been. So they knew that this country had no minerals and had no gold and had no special metals or the oil or any of that. So they wanted to base the return of 3 to 4 million Jews to this country on agriculture. There was no other choice. Luckily, many of these Russian Jews who wanted to flee Russia after the communist revolution were already farmers, and they would basically later on constitute the vast bulk of the kibbutzim and moshavim that were established here in the 1920s and 30s under the British patronage of Palestine. The British took a name invented by the Roman Empire in the 2nd century AD and basically reapplied it. Palestine, this is the Roman name that the Romans gave to this country after defeating the Jews in order to humiliate the Jews in the 2nd century AD following the Bar Kokhba revolt. And now the British, who are a big Western empire like the Romans, are reinstating the same Western imperialistic name that the Romans have invented. And so what happens is that before the British would decide what to do with the Middle East, Weizmann and Faisal got together, and Faisal had in his interest, and Weizmann was leading Zionist interests that were all about the return of 3 to 4 million Jews, and therefore you can only base it on agriculture, and for that you needed that much water. And this country doesn't have that much water. You all know that very well. What do we have? The Sea of Galilee? That's nice, but that's 700 feet below sea level, guys. Back then, it didn't help us too much. What's further above is Mount Hermon. Okay, that's a snow-capped mountain. That sounds a lot better. The Litani River, deep inside southern Lebanon of today, was going to be the northernmost border of that Zionist entity. The whole of the Golan Heights, deep into today's Syria, an area filled with wheat fields and flowing streams and beautiful areas, by the way, was going to be part of the Zionist entity as well. A lot of the Yarmouk, the river that starts in Syria and goes along the Syrian-Jordanian border until it becomes the Israeli-Jordanian border and dumps into the lower Jordan River just to the south of the Sea of Galilee, 11 miles to the south of it. Part of the Yarmouk was going to be part of the Zionist entity. The whole area known biblically as Gilead was going to be part of that Zionist entity because of its massive wheat fields. Where you are there in May, you may pause for a minute and think that you're in Minnesota. You have miles after miles after miles of nothing but wheat fields all around you. That explains why so many biblical battles took place in that luscious area. And then we have all the big streams that come down from the Transjordan Plateau into the Jordan River or into the Dead Sea. Even Petra down here would have been part of that Zionist entity had this map been put into practice. But as we all know, it didn't. It hasn't. And why? Well, it didn't because this was actually drawn in January of 1919. That's 5 months before Versailles. And in Versailles, the British have invited everybody who had some nationalistic approach, because that was part of Woodrow Wilson's 14 points document, the right for self-determination. So any nation who wanted to have its own state or its own self-determination was invited to Versailles to speak out and basically lay its claims. And that's what the Zionist movement was eventually showing to everybody in Versailles, what they had as an agreement with Weizmann and Faisal. But then circumstances have changed. Because in 1919, to this day. And so in 1921, as part of the consolation prize, not only to Faisal, but also his brother Abdallah, we see here on the staircase of the Augusta Victoria Tower, church, hospital, you name it, in Jerusalem, up on the Mount of Olives, we see here a Muslim called Emir Prince Abdallah, a Jew called the British High Commissioner to Palestine, Sir Herbert Samuel, and a Christian military minister of colonies, one Winston Churchill, standing in Jerusalem in 1921. These three of the three big religions have basically decided on the division of the British Mandate of Palestine into two different parts. This is the first time in history that the decision on the Jordan River being a border was actually ratified. And it will later on be re-ratified in 1923 and will become part of international law in the Treaty of Lausanne, which will supplement the Treaty of Versailles. And so this is when the Jordan River became a border. But I remind you guys, once again, the Jordan River has never been a border until these guys decided it will be one. And so in any case, once Abdallah got the eastern part of the British Mandate on Palestine, what we know is today's Jordan, and his brother got further away, a place called Iraq or Iraq, the western side of the British Empire was kept under direct British rule, not being subjected to any Arab, French, or any other nation for that matter, because the British wanted to keep the historic land of Israel under direct British rule, mainly because they wanted the exit point of that pipeline in Haifa to be under direct British rule, including the refineries and the Air Force bases and all the huge installation that the British would leave behind in 1948, giving the young state of Israel a very good kickstart, if you think about it. In any case, right after that had happened, the Russian Revolution, the Communist Revolution in Russia came to an end, and all the Zionist Jews were basically forced to escape. Zionism is a nation-state idea, and in communism, nation-states have no right to exist. Therefore, all the Zionists basically had to flee Russia. Some of them didn't manage to do so and found their death somehow. Okay, but Rutenberg, Pinchas Rutenberg was a Zionist Jew. He was a hydroelectric engineer who already had some substantial practice and experience in that field back from Tsarist Russia before the Communist Revolution. And the British brought him here. They wanted him to electrify the British Mandate on Palestine and to create a hydroelectric plant in the confluence of the two main rivers of this country, the lower Jordan River that meets with the Yarmouk River at a place called in Hebrew, Two Rivers. Now in the Hebrew language, everything that is two ends with Yim, Yerushalayim. How do you say river in Hebrew? Nahar. So how do you call the confluence of the two rivers? Naharaim. What you see down here is an intricate system of artificial reservoirs, dams, bridges, and the like, including one zero canal that was built by Rutenberg for over a decade in order to supply electricity from turbines that were going down here where I'm pointing with the pointer, with the surplus of the water being redirected back into the Jordan River, finding its way all the way down to the Dead Sea. Mr. Rutenberg was going to build this, first and foremost because it was a British interest. The British wanted him to provide electricity to Haifa. Haifa back then didn't have the sophisticated electricity that Europe had. And the closest place where you could generate that much electricity to Haifa was this. This is only, 50 miles away from Haifa. So the first electricity line from this power station was heading to Haifa, and eventually it was headed to both sides of the Jordan River. And both sides of the British Mandate on Palestine were enjoying that hydroelectric plant that was part of a company based out of London, no surprise, called the Palestine Electricity Company, that later on will become the Israeli Electricity Company, that was established down here in the 1920s, with that hydroelectric plant being inaugurated in 1932. If you go to that area to this day, not really recommending the summertime, guys, okay, I highly recommend. You can still see the turbines from afar. You cannot go inside. This is east of the Jordan River, so that's Jordanian territory nowadays. You can see what used to be once upon a time this lake, and you can see what used to be that canal and a few other things I'll show you later on. In any case, what you see here is down there in the confluence of these two rivers. Please note that the lower Jordan River is flowing so slowly that it's creating meanders, some sort of mini peninsulas along the way. And so that area that you see here on the right-hand side is that area that you see here where I'm pointing with the pointer. That was already a small peninsula. And at one point, Rutenberg will create here a canal that would make this whole area look like an island, surrounded on all four sides with water. And I'm going to talk about the Peace Island later on, and this is the Peace Island that I will talk about towards the end of the presentation. And so what happens is that now we have Rutenberg, who is eager to control some of the waters of the Yarmouk coming from Syria, because it will provide him enough control over the supply of water and subsequently of the supply of electricity for his hydroelectric plant. In 1916, guys, and I'm summarizing how the borders between Israel, Lebanon, and Syria were created. In 1916, the red line was put on the map by British people. How come? It's a straight line on the map. Can we see the sources, the estuaries of the Jordan River, its headwaters, anywhere inside the Holy Land? No, it was left outside. Okay, the international area was going to be, in fact, fully under French control. Even the Sea of Galilee was just partially going to be under British or semi-British control. We see that in 1916, the British didn't have a Balfour Declaration, and therefore they did not want that many Jews to come and live here. And for that, they didn't need all the waters of northern Israel to be part of their mandate, which didn't exist at the time. But the British wouldn't care about it even if it did exist, because in 1916, the British were not caring so much about any Balfour Declaration and about return of Zionist Jews to this country. And that's why the border was going further south from the headwaters of the Jordan River, leaving just a small portion of the Sea of Galilee inside the British mandate on Palestine. But after the Balfour Declaration was given in 1917, and after Versailles, and after San Remo and the division of the Middle East between the French and the British, it was time for the French and the British, now equipped with new interest, to send their lieutenant generals on a patrol with donkeys, camels, small trucks, and even on foot, going all the way between the Mediterranean, all the way following that green line, nothing to do with the green line with Jordan, by the way, creating a border called the Paulet-Newcombe border. Paulet was the French, Newcombe was the British. A border that was going to be the border between the British mandate on Palestine further south and the French mandate on Syria, which back then still included Lebanon, to the north. That border has kept too many people unhappy, including Rutenberg, who was not going to get much control over the Yarmouk coming from Syria, and therefore was unable to regulate the amount of water that would come to his hydroelectric plant further south. This has always also kept the Baha'is who lived in the southeastern part of the Sea of Galilee, before they all fled to Chicago, by the way. This was going to deprive the Baha'is access to the holy temples in Haifa and Akko. There were other people that were unhappy about it, and for us, what matters is that the Zionist movement was unhappy to see half of the Sea of Galilee being given to the French mandate and being deprived from the Zionists that were living under the British mandate. And this is why the 1921 borderline between Paulet and Newcombe had to be amended in a way that it would result in 1923 with that purple borderline called the 1923 Anglo-French borderline that was compensating almost everybody for their lost interest, and was giving everybody, including the Zionist movement, their wish. Gutenberg was now getting more of the Yarmouk, going all the way further east to the El Hama train station, where Israel now has the hot springs resorts, if any one of you ever got there. This is like half-hour drive from Tiberias. Israel, the British mandate got all of this in a way that now the French could not get to the Sea of Galilee. And even here, a border was created in a way that it will always be 10 meters from the Sea of Galilee water level, never mind how much the water would fluctuate on a given year. Therefore, that northeastern portion of the Sea of Galilee was nicknamed the rubber line, because it was changing according to the fluctuation of the Sea of Galilee, like it did last year and the year before that. Making a very long story short, the Syrians who lived in Syria under the French were not able to get any access to the upper Jordan River or to the Sea of Galilee, all along both of them. And they considered this borderline to be discriminatory, and they call it the evil line to this day. Guys, the 1923 borderline between the British and the French was kept the Syrians very much upset. They were very much annoyed by that borderline. It was basically a borderline that was favoring the Zionist movement, trying to maximize as many waters as possible into the British mandate to allow all of these waters to serve the flourishing agriculture that we would eventually create in this country. But it has deprived the Syrians from having access to that water. In a distance of 10 up to 1,000 meters from these estuaries, rivers, and lakes, the Syrians could see the water but couldn't lay their hands on them. And so that's why by the way, there are 3 headwaters to the Jordan River. The middle one is called Dan. Dan was the only one that was emerging inside the British mandate on Palestine. The other 2 called Banias and Chatzbani, otherwise known as Snir, and Banias is known as Hermon. These are the Hebrewized name of these 2. Banias and Chatzbani were emerging under the French mandate, but were going to flow into the British mandate with gravity. Together they would create the upper Jordan River that was going to dump into the Sea of Galilee. And once the Sea of Galilee was fully secured to be under British control and the waters got to it safely, the Zionist movement could later on take the water from the Jordan River or the Sea of Galilee and use it for whatever agricultural purpose they needed. That had kept the Syrians unhappy, and the British and the French had to do something about it. That's why in 1926 they signed the Good Neighbors Agreement between Britain and France. And that stated as follows: Syrian farmers and fishermen allowed to use the water along the border, even beyond the border. So they can go beyond the 10 meters or the 1,000 meters to provide water for their herds or for their agriculture, but they cannot go beyond the Jordan River or the Sea of Galilee itself. They can only go as far and come back to where they're living. Number 2, joint police station at the southern tip of the Sea of Galilee. And number 3, and that's crucial for our discussion, water from the Chatzbani and Banias will flow uninterrupted from the French mandate of Syria into British Palestine. So these 2 were emerging in France, but were flowing into Britain. They were emerging in Syria and Lebanon, but were going to be flowing into the British mandate on Palestine. And that is because the French didn't care that much about these small sources of water. They had all the big mountains of Lebanon and rivers in Syria and Lebanon, and this was a marginal piece of water for them. So that made things a bit better, but the Syrians are still calling, to this day, by the way, the 1923 Anglo-French borderline that I showed you here in the purple color, the evil line. Now it was time for the British to go one step forward. And in the 1930s, there was a big crisis in the Great Plains in the United States because of the Great Dust Bowl. One of the people who were involved in the Tennessee Valley Authority and all the other entities that were involved in the revival of these huge agricultural fields was Walter Clay Loudermilk, a devoted Protestant who favorably saw the revival of the Jewish people in their homeland. And he's sitting here with the chief engineer of the Israeli water company, Simcha Blas. That's already in the 1950s. But in the 1930s, he came here on a tour at the request of the British Empire, because by then he had such a world renown, and he came here and he was basically touring the country, trying to see how you could perfect the water and soil management of both sides of the British mandate on Palestine. He would become the patriarch of water and soil management in Israel to this day. And that's why there's a lookout, okay, in the lower Galilee, not far away from Nazareth, where someone else took that picture for me when I was 3 daughters and 10 pounds less back in 2013, I think. And that is the forest, the Walter Clay Loudermilk Lookout. Here's an enlarged picture of what you see here. Forest Lookout, Dr. Walter Clay Loudermilk, and you can also read this one, okay, which I find very, very important as well. In any case, Mr. Loudermilk was the patriarch. He was the one who started the idea of taking waters from northern Israel and making them flow to southern Israel somehow in order to create a better water management, spreading the population, allowing more and more Jews to come and live here, and not just living in northern Israel, but in other parts of the country as well. He would later on be, there will be a faculty in the Technion, the faculty for agriculture engineering that was named after him, by the way, until it got dissolved, but he's still a very famous figure in all that has to do with water and soil management in Israel. So basically, his idea was to duplicate the JVA, the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, and create some sort of a Jordan Valley Authority, okay, in the British Mandate on Palestine, as a small version of that TVA.
Gil?
And so he eventually, yes?
Gil? Hey, I just want you to notice that we are some 10 minutes before the end of the presentation. And I really, really want you to get to the point, to the Israeli-Jordanian Accord today. Okay? I know that you need another hour, but we talked about it. So
I know, I'm doing my best.
Okay, so
I'll try to speed it up. So he wrote a book. The name of the book is Palestine, Land of Promise, in which he's laying down his ideas. These ideas were basically put into practice, not in his lifetime, and not when the British were still here. But these are the guidelines for Israel's water and soil management to this day. Please notice how he's using the future tense and not the past tense, like in the Bible. In any case, these are his ideas, taking water from the north and basically funneling it to the south. That's what eventually Israel would do. And now we come to 1947, when the British would decide to leave this country, never mind now for now. And you see how in the partition plan, in the United Nations partition plan on Palestine, most of the waters of northern Israel are going to be part of the Jewish state. And that's one of the reasons why the Arabs in Palestine and elsewhere have rejected the United Nations partition plan, because the Jewish state was going to get 80% of the available water sources at the time, whereas the Arab state was going to get only 20%. So they saw that as unjust. And then when the British took off in 1948, 2 years after the French left Syria, the Syrians, who never liked the 1923 borderline made by the British and the French, said to themselves, the British and the French are both gone. Why should we accept these borderlines? And what happens is that they basically decided, a day after the British mandate on Palestine had terminated, they had decided to breach that evil line, so-called, in all sorts of points. And they made some substantial achievements with a total landmass of some 100 square kilometers. So all that I'm showing you now here on the map, shown here in pink, is what used to be part of the British mandate on Palestine until 1948. And the Syrians took it from the modern state of Israel between 48 and 49. These are 3 areas that were defined in the Armistice Treaty of 1949 to be DMZs, demilitarized zone. It's not no man's land where nobody is allowed to live. This is a demilitarized zone where you're not allowed to do anything substantial, changing reality on the ground, or putting your forces, your army troops into it. Basically, what happens is that the Syrians have agreed to retreat, not from everything that they took, but only as far back as the Jordan River itself, because they wanted the river to be a border rather than a few hundred meters east of it being the border. Remember? They saw the water but couldn't get to it. They saw it as unjust, and therefore they had decided that the Jordan River will be a border. And they have agreed to retreat only as far as the Jordan River and not further away to the 1923 borderline. All that they have retreated from was now a DMZ. And if you open your Google Maps app and you go to that area on your Google map, you would see that if you zoom in, you would still see that Google calls it a DMZ. And as we know, Google knows best. And you will see dashed line with 1949 written all along it. Also down here, we see all sorts of DMZs that were going all the way to that hot springs along the Yarmouk. So now reality on the ground has changed. And what happens is that in 1949, Israel was not in full control of these water sources. It was now divided with the Syrians. Even that rubber line along the northeastern part of the lake was now partially Syrian. And the Syrians could get to the water and do whatever they wanted there. This is the reality, topographic reality, that we all know when we travel to the Golan Heights. This is the Golan Heights, and that's the line between Israel and Syria. And you know who has the advantageous position between 1949 and 1967. In the meantime, Israel and Jordan, the two countries that were considered legit by the United States, are trying to implement Laudermilk's recommendations and create a national water carrier for themselves. This was going to be part of a much bigger peace treaty with Syria and Jordan based on a just distribution of all the water resources in the entire Middle East, distribution that was suggested by Eric Johnston, who was almost nominated, almost becoming a candidate to be vice president of the United States at one time. So he was not a rookie of any sort. He was a serious guy sent here by Eisenhower, who wanted to create a peace treaty between all of these countries so they can put them all on the American side of the Cold War and change the tide in the Cold War of the 50s in favor of the United States and against the Russians. Eventually, only Israel and Jordan had agreed to Johnston's recommendation. That's why they were the only two countries that got respective national water carriers that were provided, assisted, engineered by the United States. And that's why both canals, the Israeli one and the Jordanian one, look the same, were made by the same machinery and right around the same time. The Israeli canal was completed in 1964, and that's the Israeli national water carrier. And the Jordanian canal was completed in 1963 as far as here, and would eventually reach the upper part of the eastern side of the Dead Sea. The inauguration of the Israeli national water carrier has put the Arabs on high alert. They basically said that the creation of the Dgania Dam down here has deprived Jordan from having all the waters of the lower Jordan River that in 1964, shall I remind you, was in the middle of a country called Jordan that controlled the east bank and the west bank of that same Jordan River. So what the Arabs said is that Israel, by creating the Israeli national water carrier and by damming the water down here next to Kibbutz Dgania, so they could take as much water from the lake to other parts of Israel, that Israel was preventing the Arabs from having the waters of the lower Jordan River. And therefore, they said, we need to take from Israel what the Israelis are taking from us. Remember that two of the three headwaters of the Jordan River further north at the foot of Mount Hermon emerged in French territory that later on became Lebanon and Syria. Now it was time for the Lebanese and the Syrians to fight gravity, and along with the Soviets and the Yugoslavians and a few others, to divert two of the three headwaters of the Jordan River, along with the 25 streams from the Golan Heights that were flowing down straight into the lake, meaning into Israel, and to divert them all into a huge dam that was going to be built along the back then Syrian Jordanian border along the Yarmouk, dam that was going to provide Jordan with water that, according to their claim, Israel was depriving from them further west in here. This was going to basically starve Israel and kill Israel with thirst. And that's why Israel had a spy in Syria, whose name was Eli Cohen. Born in Alexandria, he was recruited by the Mossad and was sent to Argentina to brush up his Syrian dialect of Arabic, that is very much different from the Egyptian parallel, and had a false name, had a pseudonym, had whatever you want to call it, left a wife and 3 small children at home, and went on a very secret mission. He became Vice Minister of Defense of Syria when he got caught, broadcasting live all the info that he had. The Syrians could never understand how the Israeli tanks were firing at the Syrian tractors that were creating that diversionary canal from 6 miles away, something that tank crews cannot do nowadays with state-of-the-art Merkava tanks. That's because we had all the information in advance. We knew where they were going, when they were going, what they were going to do, and we had time to prepare ourselves, all because he gave us everything we needed to know. And so Eli Cohen, later on protagonized by Sacha Baron Cohen, okay, in the TV series The Spy that I recommend all of you to watch. By the way, all the water facts presented in the TV series are spot on correct. Spot on. They definitely made their research. Eli Cohen was the first Mossad casualty in Israel's history and will be the only one until the mid-1990s. This is the ad from May 18, 1965, when Eli Cohen was actually executed in downtown Damascus. But all the information that he gave us allowed us to win the Six-Day War and to quadruple Israel's territory in a matter of 6 days. This is off the charts, unbelievable, to say the least. Right after the war, Israel has felt so powerful that we allowed ourselves down in the Arava to penetrate Jordanian territory and to actually start digging wells inside Jordanian territory and plant all sorts of palm orchards inside Jordanian territory where the border was unmarked at the time. There was no way to know where the border was unless you came with a map and a GPS that didn't exist at the time. Please remember that. I will get back to that in just a minute. So for 40 or 50 years, the Israeli farmers down in the Arava were farming their dates, basically their palm trees, deep inside Jordanian territory. In the meantime, after the 1967 war, the Arabs have basically got weakened and Israel got stronger. The United States was now supporting Israel more heavily. And eventually we had a peace treaty with Egypt in 1979. The water distribution between Israel and Jordan was not quite the same as it was signed in the peace treaty in 1994, but there were already some major guidelines that were followed by Rabin and Hussein. Rabin and Hussein were best friends. These are all pictures taken from the Arava border crossing, where you cross from Eilat if you want to go to Petra, not on a one-day tour, by the way. I don't recommend that. In any case, you see here Rabin and Hussein had mutual trust. They're lighting each other's cigarette. I don't recommend that either. You see how Clinton is mediating between them. You see how later on they would meet in the southern tip of the Sea of Galilee, trying to basically complete the peace treaty with fine-tuning of water details, and that's where they've met, next to the water sources. And so if we go to the details of the peace treaty between the two countries, which were always under the same Western canopy, either British or American, we see here that there are all sorts of water considerations that we need to take into play. First of all, this is the bend of the Yarmouk. This is the Yarmouk comes from Syria into Jordan and then into Israel, and that's the bend that it has. Now the Yarmouk is a floody river. It comes down really fast. So if you don't stop the water somehow here, all the water will be lost and will flood all of these fields and will not be getting to the southern part of the Jordan River further south. This is why Israel and Jordan have built here a reservoir, trying to collect all the surplus, all the winter surplus of the Yarmouk, in a way that from here it will be taken to the Sea of Galilee along this pipe into the Sea of Galilee, down next to where Rabin and Hussein have actually met. Israel will collect 20 million cubic meters of water every winter for the Jordanians, and will pay them back every summer with a water installation I'm going to show you soon. This reservoir was covered with solar panels. Electricity and water do get along, by the way. And now this is the first project in Israel of how solar panels are covering this reservoir. And this is 20 million cubic meters of water that Israel is preserving for Jordan during the winter time in order to give it back to the Jordanians in the summertime. Now, there's another source called the salty springs of the northern part of the lake, next to the church of the multiplication of loaves and fishes. And this is where there are 20 million cubic meters of water of salty springs that Israel and Jordan are to divide between them, and that Israel needs to desalinate for the Jordanians their proportional share of 10 million cubic meters of water and give it to the Jordanians. So it's all flowing in Israel. We just need to take half of it and desalinate it and give it to the Jordanians. The peace treaty states that as long as we fail to do so, we will provide the Jordanians 10 million cubic meters of water from an alternate source, which is obviously the nearby Sea of Galilee. And then remember the palm trees down in the Arava? We are still pumping to this day, now as part of the agreement, 24 million cubic meters of water from Jordan. And in return, we give it back to them from the Sea of Galilee. So how much is 20 from that reservoir, plus 10 from that salty canal, and 24 down in the Arava? That's a total of 55 million cubic meters of water. This is the first 1/3 of what Israel is to allocate for Jordan, or give Jordan, if you wish, as part of the peace treaty. These 55 million cubic meters of water are just the first 1/3. And it's no gift because we are simply giving them back what we take from them elsewhere. But if you ask every Israeli who considers themselves to be someone who knows something, and there are only 9 million of those, by the way, they will all tell you that we give the Jordanians 55 million cubic meters of water free of charge as a gift. Wrong. We don't get it. They don't get it as a gift. We give them what they give us. But we take it somewhere and we give it to them somewhere else. This is part of the peace treaty. You just have to read it in order to know what it says. And remember, these 55 million cubic meters of water are just the first 1/3. The second 1/3 is that 2 reservoirs are going to be built. One by Jordan along the Yarmuk, just before that bend, and another one by Israel further south along the Jordan River after the confluence between the two. Jordan has built its own in 1998. They got fed up with Israeli bureaucracy and they decided to build their own dam. Israel has failed to build its dam to this day. The peace treaty states that Jordan should get water from both dams, but they're not getting their respective part from the Israeli dam that has yet to be built. Plus, this peace treaty states that eventually Israel will find 50 million cubic meters of water that will be assigned to Jordan from another source. And another source in our part of the world is only desalination. Guess what? That has failed to be put into practice to this day. And so the Jordanians feel at best that from the 150 million cubic meters of water that they deserve according to the peace treaty, that at best, on a good year, they are getting maybe half, maybe 75, 55 of what they are giving us and getting back with all of these water installations, and 20 to 25 million from the one reservoir that they had built and that Israel has not paid one dime for its construction. So that is one reason why the Jordanians are feeling a bit unhappy with the peace treaty with Israel, not only in terms of water, but that's another issue. I also guide in Jordan. I went there until Corona broke up. I went there 8 times a year. I got to chat with people. I got to see all of these parallels, water installations in Jordan, and to even visit some of them. They were all convinced I'm a Mossad agent or something. And eventually, I got to understand a bit of how the other side feels about us even after the peace treaty. And this is why they have decided that 2 areas that King Hussein has agreed that Israel will control, even after the peace treaty, in 1994, for a set period of 25 years, why the lease on these 2 areas was not renewed in 2019, 25 years after it was signed. The one area is Naharaim, where Rutenberg's intricate hydroelectric dam was originally built. And because of a mistake of a UN French-Canadian officer in 1949, the armistice line of 1949 has created an area east of the Jordan River under Israeli control, though the other part of the peace treaty has stated that the Jordan River itself will be the border, meaning Israel was not going to rule anything east of it, and still that area was mistakenly kept under Israeli control because of that mistake of that French-Canadian officer, UN officer. And that was time to correct, but by then, in 1994, after decades that the nearby kibbutz Ashdod Yaakov was cultivating fields in that area, Jordan has agreed that Israelis would come, that Israel will return this to Jordan, but Israelis will be allowed to come from the kibbutz through a bridge, over a bridge, into that area, travel on a guided tour through that area, and come back to Israel without going further into Jordan. It was also agreed that all of these cultivated areas will keep on being cultivated by the nearby kibbutz who had access to these areas and was allowed to bring tractors and the like for that purpose. Now, in 2018, the Jordanians followed the peace treaty down to the letter. They said exactly 365 days before the 25-year lease was going to expire, they stated, we are not going to renew the lease on Naharaim, which means that a year from now, meaning on October 26, 2019, no Israeli will be allowed into that area anymore, and the fields that were there will not be cultivated anymore. So they gave us a 1-year warning following the peace treaty down to the letter. You see here the big ceremony that they held on October 26, 2019, and we see here this much smaller ceremony that we held on that very same day on the other side, leaving that peace island for good. Guys, why were they not agreeing to renew the lease on the peace island? Because they were, and still are, a bit angry of how Israel is not keeping its obligations according to the peace treaty, or at least how they don't see Israel keeping its obligations. That's their mindset, and we have to dive into their mindset in order to know how our neighbors feel. So that's how Naharaim, one of these two areas that King Hussein allowed Israelis to cultivate and visit, is no longer under that status, and the Jordanians did everything legal when it came to Naharaim. Now Israelis cannot visit, and all the fields there are dried out. That's it. Nobody's going there anymore. Another area is the Tzofar enclave, and that's the area where members of kibbutz of Moshav Tzofar were cultivating fields 5 to 6 miles deep inside Jordanian territory, and were allowed by King Hussein to cultivate their fields inside Jordanian territory, even after the peace treaty of 1994. Israel was also allowed to pump water from underneath that area. So we can still pump the water, but that area was returned to Jordan in 2020. They gave us a 6 months extension so the farmers can close down the business and find themselves an alternative. And this is basically the closing ceremony. This is the last time that that farmer from that moshav was allowed into his field that by now are completely dry. We can see here a picture of all the greenhouses and the nearby date palm plantations. Why were the Jordanians not willing to extend the lease on that small enclave? For the same reason they were not willing to extend the lease on what was going on in Naharaim until last year. And we see here King Hussein with Crown Prince, his son, praying in that area, stating their statehood and sovereignty over an area that was partially visited by Israelis until then. And now the present and the future between the two countries. Basically, Jordan needs water in the north. That's where most of the population lives. Israel has enough water in the north, especially with desalination, Mediterranean. What we need now is water in the south. We need to sustain agriculture in the Arava. We need to allow Elat to grow, and we need better water services for all the army bases down south that were built by the Americans after the Israeli pullout from the Sinai in 1982. So that's why ministers from both countries have met back in 2015. I've met that person, Saad Abu Hamur. He is the water person of Jordan. He is the one who knows best that Jordan is the fourth poor water country in the world. And that's his minister, and that's the Israeli parallel, Silvan Shalom, used to be quite a famous person in Israel. And they have met and signed a treaty that the Jordanians will build a huge desalination installation down in Aqaba, with all the residues being taken through a pipe all the way to the Dead Sea, trying to revive its water level just a bit. And in return, Israel will give to Jordan from the Sea of Galilee waters that Jordan needed in the north, whereas they would provide us some of the waters from that desalination installation that we need in the south. And this was going to basically that was going to be an add-on to the peace treaty. So all that I gave you so far about the peace treaty didn't include any of that. That was signed in 2015. And that meant that Israel had to lay a new pipe, not the one I showed you here, that white one, which is 48-inch wide diameter, but a bigger one that is 64-inch diameter. This is a picture from last March, because now we need to give Jordan not just 55 million cubic meters of water along that pipe, but add 30 to it, and we get 85 million, and that requires a different pipe. This was completed, and water is now flowing from Israel into Jordan, or will flow once the Jordanians will basically finish the desalination installation down in Aqaba. So things are better, but are not as good as both sides were expecting after the peace treaty between Rabin and Hussein. Why the peace treaty was signed like that? We can ask Rabin, oh, he's dead. We can ask Hussein, oh, he's dead. So what we had left with is the peace treaty between the two countries. We have to read the peace treaty between the two countries, something most Israelis who have an opinion about it never did. And in order to do that, we will have a much better understanding of the peace between the two countries in particular, and in water issues in general.
Gil, thank you very much. I enjoyed it for the second time, and I hope others enjoyed it as well. We had a few remarks and a few questions during the presentation, so if you'd like to take a look at the chat.
Yes,
so, I hope these people are still with us, because we had some, we lost some participants, but I guess others would like to, to hear the answer anyhow. So please just repeat the question and then please answer.
Okay. A question from Howard. Is Howard with us? Maybe not. Okay. On one of my volunteer trips, the JNF took us down to Sderot and we stopped at one of Israel's modern water desalination plants. They explained between desalination and Israel's water reclamation, Israel is now virtually water sufficient. That is correct. Israel needs all of these waters far less than what the Jordanians need. So this is so much more important for Jordan than it is for Israel, because we have other alternatives and they don't. We have technology and they don't. So they feel that once the peace treaty was signed, that Israel secured its eastern border with Jordan, and now Israel is not thinking enough about its neighbor. That's their claim.
Right. Would the provision of more water make a huge difference to getting peace?
Yeah, of course. And it's not that we didn't give the Jordanians the information and the consultants expertise and know-how over what to do with it. Even the EU had stepped in, and I think US aid was also very much involved in water reclamation in Jordan. But their facilities are just not good enough. They have built dams and they are trying to maximize their water management, but it's run down in most cases.
Hi. On the trip, they also explained how how Israel far surpasses any other country and how much water gets reused, not necessarily to drink, but for agriculture. There was a place down near Sderot we visited, where they showed us how they clean the water, and it's just fascinating. So that the amount of water Israel recycles.
Exactly, that's absolutely true. Israel is recycling somewhere between 80 to 90% of its wastewater. That's number one worldwide by far from number two. I'm
two
sorry?
was Spain, and said I think two they said was Spain, and only 18%.
Yeah, maybe Spain got to 22, 23 by ever since, because now they are at the verge of getting to 25, but they're nowhere near what we are achieving down here. Nowhere near. We are almost taking every water that goes down anywhere, and we are reusing it just for agriculture. And not all of it has to be treated all the way through, because some plants like date palms can absorb so much salinity, and the dates come out sweeter if you use that much salt. Yeah. And so why take the salt out if you can get sweeter dates without taking them out?
Yeah.
So your remark is spot on, correct. That is very much true.
Okay,
we have 140 water reclamation facilities in Israel, by the way. A lot of them were built with kind donation of the JNF and other donors. Now, next question by Ray.
Gil, just a sec. Since I can see that we have, we keep losing participants, which is totally understandable and okay. So I would like to thank you all, guys. We keep having the conversation. We're not leaving. So if you want to speak, that's great. And if you want to go to other things, so that's okay as well. And thank you for joining us. The donations, again, I appreciate it by Gil, of course. And I would like to invite you all to my presentation the day after tomorrow, this Thursday, same time. There will be no live Zoom tour because of the lockdown. So we will have a presentation, and that will be about Ha'apala, the illegal Jewish immigration during the British Mandate time, and the athlete detention camp for the Ma'apilim. So I was working on the PowerPoint presentation for the whole day. I will keep working on it tomorrow, and I hope you will join me for it. So thank you all, and I hope to see you all, and we are back to you, Gil.
This was wonderful. It was wonderful. We could have listened for another hour.
Yes.
You should get Gil to come for phase 2.
Sure, I will. I will.
Absolutely.
I hope he will be. Absolutely. He has quite a few very, very interesting presentations. And I will be very, very happy to invite him. And I really hope he will be willing to come. So yes. Okay. So let's continue with this presentation.
Yeah, that would be my pleasure, by the way. Would the provision of more water, let me see, I didn't skip anything. Would the provision of more water make a huge difference to getting peace? Of course. As stated before, water is the #1 key factor in Middle Eastern geopolitics. At par with oil, I would say, because oil is the big picture, what water is the small picture. And you know, sometimes the small picture is what makes a big difference. So basically, absolutely. The more water we can invent, create, reclaim, desalinate in the Middle East, the better it will be for everybody. And the uprising, the Syrian civil war had started not because of any ideological clashes that were basically existing for thousands of years between tribes, religions, ethnicities, and the like. It came down to the shortage of water and the unjust distribution of water inside Syria. And when the Syrian farmers, who are mostly Sunnis, had nothing to drink, and they couldn't create their own food and couldn't get any income from no source, what they had left to do was just to fight against the regime that was basically subjugating them to get to that situation. So more water would definitely make a huge difference. Rabin and Hussein understood that. They didn't just make claims, you know, they didn't just make statements and the like. They basically went down to the smallest details and actually met with an Israeli lieutenant general at his kibbutz somewhere in northern Israel, and he went over all the details of behind the scenes of all of these numbers they gave you. And it was even more fascinating, but I couldn't fit it into our presentation. Howard, the original uprising in Syria was precipitated in the shanty towns surrounding Damascus, which were filled with farmers whose wells had run dry. Yeah, that's the Syrian civil war in 2011. That we used to go up to the Golan Heights, to Mount Ben Tal, and basically go to the movies with a coffee cup, with a coffee mug in our hands. We were basically seeing whatever was going on inside Syria along the border with Israel. It was impressive and sad at the same time. Why would the Jordanians not continue to cultivate the fields and have it benefit their people? Are you talking about the Peace Island, Christine? Is Christine still with us? I would assume that Christine is talking about the Peace Island. Or
yeah, I was confused as to because the water was coming from the Jordanian side. So were they not able to utilize any of it to create, continue the fields?
Which segment of which landmass are you talking about exactly?
Well, I guess we go back to the Peace. On any of them at this point. I mean, I understand if they don't have the water resource, but in the situations where they could get water, they just left it all to go fallow?
No, they were using every drop of water they could get their hands on.
Okay.
But you have to understand, remember Mr. Johnston who gave recommendations over how to divide the waters in the Middle East?
Correct.
Yeah, Johnston recommended that of all the waters between Israel, Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan will get 54% of all of it. Israel will get 31%, Syria would get 12%, and Lebanon, that has enough water elsewhere, would get only 3%.
Okay.
From all the waters that are shared between the four countries according to the borders in the 1950s. You know, of the 54% that Jordan was going to get, at best, in a good year, they reached to 1/3 of that.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, Jordan and all the Jordanians who know about these issues are unimpressed with the claims that you got that much water and you did nothing with it. They did a lot with it. They don't have the technology. They never got what they were promised, and therefore they couldn't get anywhere near our achievement. But I actually think that it's our role as their neighbors. You know, you have to keep good neighbors to help them. And we have made substantial steps in that direction. And interestingly enough, a lot of the substantial steps going forward with the Jordanians were made before the peace treaty. And after the peace treaty, we forgot a bit about our commitment to Jordan. Let's hope that things will get better. You can also go on the website of EcoPeace, which is an NGO. I actually was on a tour of EcoPeace of 10 Israeli tour guides, 10 Jordanian tour guides, and 10 Palestinian tour guides. And the tour was in Jordan. It was about rehabilitating the lower Jordan River that in recent years is no more than a sewage canal, unfortunately.
Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, right now.
Yeah, okay. The lower Jordan River ever since 1964 became basically a sewage canal, unfortunately. So Israel, Jordan, EcoPeace, NGOs, USAID are trying to rehabilitate the lower Jordan River. And I got to be on a tour with a total of 30 tour guides that share the lower Jordan River. And that helped me understand who are the people in EcoPeace, what they're trying to do. And I still keep in contact with them to this day. So you can go to their website. They have a lot of good info down there. Bevakasha. Let me see the following question. So Israel was the party who first renegade on the promise. Which promise, Eleanor? Is Eleanor still with us?
Well, I guess she was talking generally about the water part of the peace treaty.
Okay. Yeah, the water part of the peace treaty is made out of 3 elements. Each contain 50 million cubic meters of water, roughly. Okay. Now, guys, all of Israel's water supply, 2.4 billion cubic meters of water, is what goes down the Niagara Falls on one day. On one day. So, the water amounts, the water consumptions that we're talking about here, is a drop in the bucket for any American ear. But for an Israeli ear, it's a lot. Okay, it's just to give you guys the proportions. Israel was the party who first renegated on the promise. I would say that I read a book written by the first Israeli ambassador to Jordan. Not the first Jordanian ambassador to Israel. The first Israeli ambassador to Jordan. He's a professor. He used to be an ambassador in Cairo as well. So he's well familiar with the Arab world. His name is Professor Shimon Shamir. He wrote a 600-page book, and he's putting most of the blame on the failure of a lot of the projects that were dreamt about by Israelis and the Jordanians. He's putting most of the blame on the failure of these projects on Israel. Why? You can go and read the book. 600 pages, that will keep us busy during Corona. I highly recommend that you find that book. I think it got translated to English, and read. And that's what the first Israeli ambassador to Jordan is writing, not just a tour guide. Let There Be Water, yeah, famous. Thank you very much. Thank you guys very much. Toda rabba, toda lachem. There are other books that I can recommend.
Can I make one comment?
Yes, please.
I guess one reason why I don't know if water by itself will help resolve differences. Again, they told us there's this technology Israel invented that actually takes air out of the air and creates water. Where you can put this big machine and drive it by truck someplace, and you get water out of it. And they offered this technology to South Africa because one of their cities was 2 years ago was going dry. They were actually had maybe two months, Cape Town, 2 months of water supply left. And their hatred of Israel was such they said we'd rather go without water than accept any assistance from Israel. They would not take the technology from Israel, a machine that literally creates water out of the water vapor, and they wouldn't take it.
Well, that's their problem.
But as I'm saying, sometimes water may not. If the hatred is such, even the water, offering water itself, might not be alone, because sometimes the hatred is such that it overwhelms common sense.
I know. That goes everywhere in politics, I guess. But I got to tell you that if people are unwilling to get water innovations from the chosen people, so that's their problem, I guess. What can I tell you? I know of other people, but I know that Iraq in the 90s under Saddam Hussein was getting water from Israel. Obviously, that was clandestine and secretive, and nobody knew about it. But now it's kind of published. All the isles in the Mediterranean that sustain all of these British tourists who are coming there to change their color from white to pink under the scorching Middle Eastern sun, they all live out of Israeli desalination installations that provide for the hotels and the like. And you can go to Australia and India, and drip irrigation that has changed the world and basically allowed humans to get to 7.5 billion just because we can make so much more food with that much less water. So I would dare to say that one would be a fool not to accept Israeli water technology. And that's why the country that regularly hosted an international water conference called Water Tech was always Israel. It was always hosted in Israel every 3 years, I think. And I got to guide a lot of the participants, and they were praising Israel all the time, never mind where they were coming from. So if someone is not willing to take a water technology, okay, let them go try.
Thank you, Gil. This is Steve. I was just wondering if the water issue was a political football within Israel.
It used to be. We used to have on the TV screen, as part of the advertisements, we used to have a girl whose face was cracking up, you know? You could see her face cracking because there was not enough water. That was in the early 2000s and also a decade ago. So they were telling her to dry out all the lawns. They were telling her not to irrigate this and that. Eventually, now she's off the screen. We haven't heard or seen her, you know, for 5 to 6 years because desalinization has really changed the rules of the game. I got to tell you that if you want to see that girl now with her cracking, you have to open Jordanian television because people in Jordan are getting running water in the tap 1 day a week. So if you go to Amman on a summer day, you would open the tap on a Sunday and water will come out of it for 6 to 12 hours, and that's it for the rest of the week, not for the rest of the day, for the rest of the week. Yeah. And so it used to be a political tool in Israel's policy, not that much anymore, just because there's enough and it's sufficient at the moment. And now the Jordanians, they are the ones who have a huge water problem that they hope Israel will help them fix, or at least, I would say, decrease.
By the way, but with the desalinization, what made it, they've always had it, but the way technological innovation is now is infinitely cheaper. It used to be very expensive to convert to desalinize water. Now with this inventions that Israel came up with a couple of years back, it's extremely cheap. That's what makes it feasible.
That's right. It went down from $1 per cubic meter to 45 cents per cubic meter, and that's obviously a game changer. And that is the main reason why Israel has started building these desalinization installations and even outsourcing the construction of some of them to other companies, as long as they were Israelis, or at least co-owned by Israelis, starting the early 2000s. And now we reach a situation in which not only we have enough, but we also have backup. We have surplus that we could just, press a button and we could desalinate much more water than what we have now, which is sufficient at the moment. So we even have reservoir, we even have reserves.
They're selling them overseas. I think California bought 2 of them.
That's right. We have an installation built in San Diego. Yeah, we're all over the place. Other questions, guys?
Well, I don't think we have that many guys left, so maybe that's it. Could it be possible? Hey guys, last chance for questions.
Well, Gil, thank you so much for a very informative conversation that commingled science and lots of law and international treaties. My goodness, you gave us a 3-credit course here. When's the examination? I hope it's not next week.